What is a Woman?
Oh, I saw a ton of ads for that on YouTube.
Actually, hilarious. Oh, well, of course, I went to the C's, didn't pay YouTube.
Yeah, based.
But it was
Admitting
actually
crimes
it was so
on
funny. Like,
podcasts.
it's just,
Just the clips I saw from it and the ad trailer for it
Yeah.
actually made it look funny as opposed to cringe. Like,
I
there's
think
a fine line.
He said in an interview he was initially gonna like go after, like, turn it more into like a confrontational one, but then when he had a couple interviews and he got them talking and he didn't say anything and they just started saying insane shit. He's like, "Oh, this is how we're gonna do it. I'm just gonna ask them a question like this, like, what is a woman?" And I'm just gonna let them ramble.
oh no, but it like
Let's see what
they get
happens.
confrontational with him over like him asking like the most basic questions.
Yeah, but
Like,
he was thinking of kind of
A
like
modern
being
day
much more
Socrates.
confrontational person throughout like himself. But then he realized like the funnier and more illuminating way to go about it was just asking that question and watch them melt down. And so that's what he did.
well, the one professor was having a meltdown because he was talking about like truth, and he's like, you know what? The guy's like, I really don't like the way you bringing up truth. I'm gonna stop this interview.
It's like,
oh
oh,
no,
interesting that truth is a problem for you.
it's so inflammatory. Truth.
Well,
Better stop the
you can
interview.
quibble about the definition, but it's really, I think that's quite telling that he's, to even bring up the word is.
He said it was transphobic to bring up truth. That's what he said.
Oh my God! Like, how are these people like retaining their jobs? You should just be permanently barred from the workforce at that stage.
And there's just so many moments where it's so clear like how insane things are that in that like anyone with a functioning brain, you're just like, what the fuck is going on? Like, how, like, he goes to the women's march and he's just like going around asking what is a woman, and like he just gets blank stares like for 30 seconds. People are just like looking at him like can't answer, and then someone like yells at him like people start chanting asshole. And it's like literally all he's doing is asking what is a woman at the women's march.
would
Someone
think
should have
that they would
responded,
have-
a featherless bipod.
You would think that they would have at least some canned answer, but yeah, again, I think that's quite telling that they don't.
Well, again, the canned answer that he gets like 3 times is like, a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman. And he's like, okay, what does identifies mean? Like, what do you mean by identifies as a woman? And it's like, anyone who identifies as a woman is a woman. Like, can you give a non-circular definition? And it's like, I don't know. Like, that's the deepest they thought about it, I guess, is like, oh, we'll just say whoever identifies. And then, I don't know. I just like crazy that your theory is so like
Shallow.
yeah, like
Two super simple questions completely shorts out the entire thing. Yeah, that's
it's just like,
impressive.
yeah, what do you guys talk about in class? Like like the professor that he asks, like, you're a genders studies professor, like what do you guys talk about for like hundreds of hours a semester that didn't come up before?
I took gender studies and like discussed this with my professor, and she basically just said, yeah, I mean, there's really nothing. This is just relabeled personality theory. I mean, she wasn't that harsh to it. I was that harsh to it. And she was basically like, yeah, that's pretty much can't disagree with that.
Well, at least she's somewhat sensible from the sounds of it.
Well, she was quite sensible because she also taught women's studies. And like, you know, if you teach women's studies, you have to actually understand that there's such a thing as a woman.
She'd
That's
probably
bold.
be labeled a TERF and lose her job soon.
Oh, she actually definitely would have been on like a TERF hit list if she lived in some sort of cosmopolitan city. Like, she's always talking about feminism, and, you know, in the sort of sense that people that actually cared about feminism talk about it.
Sad that that's now somewhat based. All right. Well, welcome to the newest episode of Troglodyte Radio. And today we're going to be talking about stagflation. It's probably not a term that most people have heard of yet, unless you were cogent in the 1970s and remember the economic hardships of that time. So we're going to give you guys an overview of what it is, just because this is starting to creep back into the modern economy. We'll give you an overview of like the theory of it, what happened with it before, how it relates to the current day, similarities and differences, and then basically how it impacts you and what things you can do to try to stem off any problems that arise from it. So Hubbards, if you want to kick off the basics of like the economic theory around it, what it is, why it's different than other things or other issues in economic terms.
Yeah, I think probably just starting with the basics of what it is the simplest, and that's stagflation is exactly what it sounds like, which is a stagnant economy, so not growing or growing like below expectation or below kind of standard rates, and then combined with high unemployment and inflation, like above expectation inflation. So above, like, in modern terms, we'd want 2% inflation or around 2%. So if you have inflation above that, you have unemployment above your regular natural level, and you have slow growth. There you go. You have stagflation. And the reason that it's a concern, I guess, that economists and policymakers get nervous around stagflation is it's a tricky situation to be in because you don't have a lot of options to get out. And it's not really a regular part of the business cycle. Like, it's not like economies, go through it every, a decade or a couple decades, a period of stagflation, and there's tried and true methods of getting through it, or it just naturally resolves itself or whatever. It doesn't matter. Oh, go ahead.
To that point, as it not being a natural part of the business cycle, there's an economist named Phillips who charted the inflation and the employment in England over 100 years from, I think, 1820 to 1920, or somewhere in that ballpark. And he found a pretty solid fit between low inflation and high unemployment, or high inflation and high employment, which is obviously the opposite of stagflation. And so that's kind of how you get the sense that in this 100 years of unmolested economic going-ons, there had not been stagflation.
Yeah, and that's called the Phillips curve. And it was widely accepted as like the premier model in terms of like modeling that portion of the economy. And basically, if you had high inflation, you would have, or if you had high unemployment, you would have like deflationary period, and vice versa. Like, they moved in tandem that way, and it was always thought that that's how it would stay pretty much going forward. And stagflation obviously is the opposite of that, and so it was not something people thought was even possible within the economy.
Well, within the Keynesian perspective, which was almost completely dominant, there are a few economists in the Federal Reserve even that said stagflation could happen, but they were the mavericks. The vast majority just ignored them because they weren't following established tradition of economic theories.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then the Keynesian theory held that stagflation was impossible. And one of the mavericks who wasn't in the establishment was Friedman, who wrote a book about the history of money in the United States. And this I found very bizarre, is that at the time in the 1960s, it was a maverick viewpoint to consider inflation the result of monetary policy. Most people thought there were other causes to inflation. I mean, the obvious one being the Phillips curve. And if you just want to really simplify it and say inflation is caused by high employment. And there were other theories as well. But the monetary theory was a side note that was well received by economists at the time, because Friedman's book was a well-done history of the United States, but it catapulted him into sort of the mainstream, it seems like, after when he predicted that stagflation could occur in the conditions that were being created in the United States. It did occur.
Yeah, so I guess just to cover the whole basis on the views, like you were saying, the Keynesian was high unemployment and high inflation can't happen together. The classical view, basically, of the economy was that inflation, like price level, like demand and supply, would naturally just reach equilibrium without much problem. So if the economy was chugging along and then, say, demand dropped substantially, there wouldn't need to be any government intervention into the economy, because you could simply wait for prices to drop, and then at the new price level, demand would equal supply, and you'd go back to your original, point on the long run supply curve, which would mean you'd be back at full employment and no problem there. And then the Keynesian intuition or observation was that prices are sticky. So supply, like, it's hard to do in a audio form, but if you think about a supply curve with sticky prices, it's horizontal and a downward sloping demand curve. Therefore, if demand drops and prices stay the same, your GDP and therefore your employment actually drops. And that was like, Great Depression 101 was prices were sticky, demand dropped, and employment fell dramatically. So the Keynesian view was the government does need to intervene in the short run to stimulate demand back up to higher levels, which gets you back to your original point and full employment. Neither of the classical or the Keynesian view, does allow for really stagflation based on that. So and the Phillips curve also is basically Keynesian, which he was the one who observed the relationship between inflation and unemployment. And what economists started to realize during the 1970s with stagflation happening was that their modeling of it was that there is a short-term relationship between unemployment and inflation, but there is also a long-run vertical curve for the long-run Phillips curve, and that's basically at natural unemployment levels, which is, that being around 4 to 6% unemployment in the economy as like your kind of rule of thumb for like the natural full employment rate. They started theorizing you can't get down to 0% or extremely low levels of unemployment. There's some sort of natural level of unemployment that persists in the economy, structural like unemployment that you just will never get rid of, even at quote unquote full employment.
Yeah,
and
to kind of quickly interject there, like how that would happen is you have unemployment for those who are looking to find different jobs, and they remain unemployed for a bit while they look for like a new career path or something like that. These are like pretty basic things that they don't go away. They're hence being called structural. They're kind of baked into the unemployment landscape.
And to add to that, the fact that they're baked in, that's one of the contentions that people have with this model from other perspectives that may or may not have been able to explain to stagflation, but now they're backpedaling and trying to figure out how to fit it into their economic worldview. And so Friedman was a big fan. I don't know that he devised the initial theory, but he had his own theory with the systemic unemployment or the baseline unemployment, and people basically said you don't have enough evidence to say for sure that there even is a baseline. Like that can't be adequately demonstrated. But when you assume that baseline, then everything else also seems to fall into place. So it makes for quite a good model.
Yeah, and I guess to put it into simple terms, the eventual model that allows for stagflation is one where you have, again, you still do have a fixed long run aggregate supply that's vertical. That's like your maximum output. And you have at the margin, you have a maximum vertical section of your supply curve, and that makes sense, right? There's a certain point along the curve where the factories can't output anything more. There's just literally no more resources at your disposal to increase supply, even if you wanted to. And then there's the zone in which Keynes was right, which is at the at the beginning of the supply curve, which is horizontal, where prices are sticky, and then there's an intermediate zone around where your aggregate demand generally would intersect, where it's connecting the two, sloping, curve sloping, and that kind of integrated all the different observations, where you could have both stagflation, but you could also have Keynes right in certain times in the economy where you did need to stimulate demand to get back up to equilibrium, because you would have sticky prices in situations as well. So yeah, I guess the general cause of stagflation, I still not like settled, but I think there's kind of two necessary components that you would see, which is a supply shock and essentially inadequate or incorrect monetary policy in response. So the supply shock would increase prices. That's just a negative supply shock is going to reduce the amount of commodities you have, which is obviously going to increase their prices. That's going to cause inflation initially. And then what will happen is, if the central banks respond to the supply shock by printing money and going with an easy monetary policy, because they don't understand that it's a supply shock that's doing or causing the problem, and they just want to increase demand right away to get back to full employment and equilibrium, that'll just cause further inflation, and that will cause a spiral that causes it won't stimulate the economy enough to grow the economy, and it'll increase prices. So then you just get increasing prices without a stimulated economy, which is a fairly good fit for the actual events of the 1970s, which was like where the first real stagflation was observed.
I think the interesting thing with the 1970s that I saw when I looked at the timeline was that there had been a moderate recession in the 60s that was dealt with in Keynesian fashion, which was to give economic stimulus. The government creates more demand because consumers aren't doing enough. But then the government didn't want to tone down their stimulus because everything was going good. And that kind of left them with not all the tools in the shed to work on the next problem, which ended up being the supply shock that led to stagflation. And it seems to be quite a potent parallel, in my mind at least, to the fact that our governments have not wanted to tighten up the monetary policy since 2008. And now we're getting hit with supply shocks.
Well, and I guess we should elaborate on the 1970s supply shocks, which was essentially oil, energy, which ties in with our previous conversation on the podcast, and the importance of energy goes into literally everything in the economy. It is analogous to work. And in 1973, basically because the U.S. supported Israel in their war in the Middle East, OPEC, which was it's like the cartel of oil producing countries, and at that time was like 50% of oil production in the world. At first, it reduced output, and then after further U.S. support, embargoed the U.S. and other Western countries supporting Israel, which just obviously at that time, I believe the U.S. imported about a third of their oil and was by far the largest consumer of oil, using 1/3 of the entire world's oil, despite being 6% of the population at the time. So that was like a huge supply shock. Like it increased oil increased from roughly $2 a barrel to $11 a barrel. So more than 5x, which is, if you put it into that is like one difference with today, right? Like oil has gone up with the supply shock with oil on current day is not
to the same degree.
It's just not comparable. And eventually they did end the embargo in 1974. But then there was a further oil shock when Iran basically shut off all oil production in the late 1970s due to the change of regime. So it was a huge energy crisis essentially throughout the 70s. And it was also at a time when the U.S. was even more oil dependent than now. So there you go for your supply shock.
One thing I found that the neoliberals' perspective that we're talking about this were still bitter about. I'm not sure how much it affected it. I didn't see any quantification of it, but price controls on gasoline that would result in your classic images of thousands of cars lined up at the gas station because everyone could afford gas because it was price controlled, but there's only so much gas that could be sold before they were out. And price controls, obviously, I hope obviously, don't lead to good incentives to increase your alternatives, or basically just let things change the way they should be given the situation. So you had this incredibly expensive oil for the time, and then it was price controlled as the refined product as gasoline, so that you didn't have as much demand destruction as you should have seen, and probably not as much creation of oil extraction in the United States as you should have seen.
Well, and that's a good point, and also leads into that is one of the bad response policies that it's pointed towards as being a cause of stagflation is price controls, because exactly what you said doesn't allow for a natural adjustment to supply and demand, and you get shortages and all sorts of other. The big difference,
if thinking of it on the individual level, whether or not you can drive your car out for the weekend depends on whether or not you line up at the pump in time, versus you driving your car out for the weekend is going to cost you, I mean, we'll put in today's terms, $500. It's a lot more. Yeah, you'll line up and you'll hope you'll get the gas, and then you'll go do your thing that you wanted to do. But if it was expensive, you just wouldn't do it.
Exactly. And, if it's very expensive, then the argument is the people most willing to pay are probably the ones that have the most utility from using it, right? If gasoline quadruples or whatever, then only the people that are actually getting quite a bit of benefit from using gasoline will continue to use it. And those that, are just, if someone's driving to work with their gasoline versus going for a countryside, jaunt on the weekend, like you said, then which one is going to actually respond to the increase in price and not buy? It's going to be the leisure's going to drop off first, right? Which keeps the economy going because the person that actually needs it gets to use it. So do we want to elaborate on how the stagflation was eventually ended, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to segue into. I can kind of lay out the basics. So they had for quite some time this problem of stagflation. The economy was not doing so well. They had pretty high inflation. Like at one point, it hit 13.3% in the States, which is like pretty mind blowing. And obviously, like we had described before, your tools don't work. Like the tools that they had at the time didn't really, like, they weren't going to work to have a nice soft landing where they could kind of go down the middle, get the economy back and rolling, get the inflation down. So they actually, the president, was this, I think it was Carter, was it not?
I'm not certain.
Yeah, it was Carter.
Yeah, Carter brought in Paul Volcker. He was a neoliberal and like a student basically of Milton Friedman, who we had already mentioned. And he was tasked with the sole job of getting inflation in check first, because they found that to be the more damaging of the two, versus they felt that the rampant inflation was more harmful to their economy than the low growth at the time. So he was tasked with just figuring out a way to fix that. And he, as a subscriber to Milton Friedman's economic theory, which basically said the way that you get inflation under control is you have to take money out of the system. Like it's more of like it's a monetary issue. And so what he basically did, and for any listeners who were alive back in this time might remember, he just jacked up interest rates extremely high. So they hit at one point like 18%. And that was extremely hard on the people. He got quite a few death threats actually over this. But he was able to rein in inflation quite well. But it did spark off a pretty rough recession in, I believe, what that would have been 80 to 81, I think.
There's two recessions. There's one in 79 to 80, and there's one in 80,
and then
81 to 82.
Yeah, so that is how they fixed it, but it took a pretty big lift from the government, and pretty much was the perfect way to make them extremely unpopular. I think that's one of the reasons why Carter's so reviled by a good chunk of the population who was alive back then, because under his leadership, that's what happened. And, like imagine having a $500,000 house now and you have to pay 18% interest on it. Like you're just screwed. So,
and I think the simple way to sum that up that applied then, I think just as much as it applies now, is that the general public has little economic understanding, but they do understand that the government spending money can kind of keep the pain away. So when they don't see the government spending money, and then the pain hits even harder, and then in this case where they actually jacked up the interest rates to add a further turn of the screw, it's like the public is not going to be happy in any way, shape, or form. And
yes,
it's like you basically have to go on a suicide mission to solve this sort of problem.
That's kind of what it was, I think. Well, because Carter didn't get reelected. I think he was one of the, he and Trump are some of the few presidents that didn't get a second term after their first. Like they lost as incumbents. I'm going to fact check myself there, but I'm pretty sure Jimmy Carter.
There's a bunch of weird rules about American presidents and whether or not they win as incumbent.
I'm pretty sure you're right. I think that was the Reagan.
Yeah, that's where he lost to. Yeah, and Reagan just smoked him. It was an unbelievable blowout. It was 489 to 49 for Electoral College. Reagan won 44 states.
And gives you a lot more respect for Carter.
Yeah, so it turned out to be a suicide run, but that is what finally broke the back of the rampant inflation caused a recession and really hurt quite a few Americans. But that was basically the only way you could actually fix it, at least through the current tools that they had. And from my reading, that's still the only way to fix it, is you have to jack up. Like, if you do get yourself into a period of high inflation, you have to deal with it through just jacking up interest rates and sucking money out of the economy. And by sucking money out of the economy, for people, it's not like they're taking bales and bales and bales of cash and burning them. Basically what they're doing is they're getting people to not spend it, so that money isn't circulating throughout the economy. So they issue T-bills, like the government basically issues a whole bunch of treasury bills, so people buy bonds from the government, and they get, especially if you have high interest rates at the time, like those will return pretty well, but it takes a big chunk of what would be otherwise money that's circulating and getting spent, just on basic stuff, like, companies spending it on materials and labor and all of that, and the people spending it on mostly it's like the people, because companies buy the bonds as well, but the people, instead of spending it on cars and whatnot, food and all of that, they were like, okay, I could, get a T-bond that has like 10% interest. Okay, that's a really good return. Like, I'm not going to get that elsewhere, so I'm going to, dump 20 grand into a T-bill, and then that money gets pulled out. So it's going to that cash sits in basically the T-bill for a while, and it then has the effect of actually extracting the money out of circulation. At least
I think this is a good point.
I understand it.
To throw in the true wild cards of the economic theory realm, which are the Austrian economists, because they don't like any top-down theories. They don't even like macroeconomics. They think everything is individual behavior. And rather than a really complicated system for, dealing with stagflation or solving these problems, what they want in the world is basically to destroy all financial institutions the government runs, so the central banks, and just leave the market to do its own thing and run through business cycles. And if you get burned, you get burned. But theoretically, you probably would never see a stagflationary event if you didn't have any sort of government stimulus at any point ever, not even being possible, is at least what they think. Like, most of them, if not all of them, would just tell you that the central bank is actively doing more harm than good to the economy of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I would say maybe in the last few years, you get more people agreeing with that.
Well, yeah, it does seem to be a sort of like having a renaissance of sorts, although it already had a renaissance. So I don't know if maybe it's now an enlightenment, but it's popular, I think, because of the fact that it doesn't really prescribe. Like, listening and reading about it, I almost would think of it as like barstool economics, because it's where you sit down and you say, oh, well, if you raise the minimum wage, well, then that employer is just not going to hire somebody, and that person is not going to be hired as unemployed, and now you've just raised unemployment. And the whole logic being like what one individual will do and then just expanding it, rather than having a theory about what minimum wage does to aggregate graphs and like, oh, well, in the past, minimum wage correlated with unemployment like this. And they'd be like, no, we're just dealing with individuals here, not the past, not statistics, nothing. The hardcore ones.
Well, and then you have the whole Austrian school getting intertwined with cryptocurrency, which is really helpful for understanding things.
Yeah.
Has made that space very much better. Definitely helps to have your proponents of your economics school be, peddling Bitcoin maximalism and all this other stuff. So I don't know.
It kind of dovetails with the barstool thing. Like, what's the next thing on your docket? You're going to talk about Bitcoin with the boys.
Yeah, it's hard to get a objective overview of Austrian economics, because it's become very intertwined with cryptocurrency and like used as a justification for why Bitcoin's going to reach $10 million or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
kind of annoying because it'd be nice to read clean analysis, but such is life. Do we want to go from the 1970s to now, or is there anything left to cover on the historical front, I guess?
I think we've kind of covered it pretty well from the historical front. Then we can just draw like later on some comparisons and flesh it out.
Yeah, I
Then
think that works.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we already did touch on some of the comparisons, like the supply shock. That you could see a lot of parallels to today. You know, we have nonstop news about supply chain issue, and then that was like for 2 years during the pandemic, and then now with Ukraine-Russia war, then you have actual, potential of large commodity shortages with, Russian energy off the market, but also Russian and Ukrainian food,
fertilizer,
potentially off the food, fertilizer, metals. There's a lot of metals that come out of the area, like all sorts of things that are primary inputs to so many things that we use. That you could see, definitely a parallel there. Again, the energy pricing so far has not actually translated into the same, degree of increase. We saw oil. I don't know what it actually topped out at.
I think
earlier,
you definitely have the potential to see that sort of effect if Russia had turned off the natural gas taps to Europe. Like that's where you definitely, and even without them turning it off in winter in Europe, things might get incredibly difficult.
Well, that is a good point because natural gas has actually gone up in, factors of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6x, right? In Europe,
it was like 10 times. It had like 10x, and at one point I recall it had gotten
it's getting pretty wild.
For Germany, you might actually see a more of a direct parallel between the 1970s and now. The U.S. being energy independent, not so much. And, the U.S. still is the biggest economy. So whether or not, I think that would be a big difference with the 1970s is in the 1970s, you had the U.S., the biggest economy, as well as other Western nations that were reliant on oil exports. All of them were facing this super bad supply shock. Whereas now, it is more concentrated regionally. And you could even make the argument that some regions could get cheaper pricing, like China. Maybe not right now, but eventually might
they can sign off a bunch of the Russian.
Yeah, they might be the only customer or one of the only customers, along with, say, India, who are vying for Russian energy exports, and Russia might crank the taps and be exporting more and cheaper energy to those regions than they were before. And
they already are selling more to them by a pretty decent chunk. I think India was
not really. they like China has not taken advantage of or can't really take advantage of Russian oil yet because
they don't have the
not really,
but they had been buying more, but it wasn't
but it's just not a substantial amount. Like it's just there's not enough.
Their purchases had
transport
gone up quite a
infrastructure,
bit, but they already didn't purchase very much from them. Like
they get almost all their oil from the Middle East.
Yeah, so like their purchases had gone. I think China's went up like 30% or something from Russia, but it was like a really small amount that they were buying from Russia. So, yes, it's up 30%, but that makes a tiny factor in terms of their total energy requirements, like their energy purchases. So, but if they want to build out the infrastructure, that'll take a number of years, but it's a huge incentive, right? Might as well build a big ass pipeline from Russia to China. You have the territory for it.
Yeah, they already are building pipelines, several pipelines from China or from Russia to China. One's already been completed, but they are adding a lot of capacity.
So it's India that's buying the most Russian crude right now. I believe they've increased their barrels of Russian crude in a month from 7 million to 24 million already.
Yeah, that's quite a bit. That's monthly.
So that's quadrupled. Not quite quadrupled.
That's their monthly
Yeah.
purchases.
Like it's in
quite
terms
a
of
bit,
like how much oil it actually is. Like Russia sells, I think, 2 million barrels a day still. So
Yeah,
60
so it's still
million
not
a month. So that's like about a third or so of what Russia's selling to India.
Yeah, so I think going back to like the supply shock question, I could see it going either way. Like, it's the current supply shock is pretty bad. Although there's definite arguments to be made that it's not as bad, right? Then the second part of the equation is the monetary policy that in response. So far, we have gotten pretty aggressive interest rates hikes in the U.S. and Europe as well as Canada. So they are responding with interest rate hikes in response to the inflation. Some, I think you could make an argument that it's not as aggressive as needed, or needs to be it needs to maintain the aggressive rates for a while longer to really get inflation under control. Like, we can't, in the next 6 months, we can't start having a pause or even rate cuts. Which
one thing I was specifically seeing about America is that they basically did like a 180 pivot from buying up assets and whatnot to raising interest rates in a very short period of time, which to the economists that were writing about it, I was reading, was baffling, because the indications that they would need to raise rates were coming. And up until basically the day they raised rates, or maybe the month, they were still applying sort of a stimulus to the economy. Just like it sort of boggles the mind what's going on with their forecasting, because that is the main goal of these Federal Reserves or central banks, is to forecast and act appropriately. And they kept forecasting transitory inflation until about a month before they realized they needed to start jacking rates really quickly.
That is a good point. Like, I think there's another argument to be made that they should have started rate hikes a year before they did, right? That being said,
like independent economists were forecasting this quite a long time before the central banks.
Yeah, and so you could make the argument they should have done it earlier, but I mean, at least they started. I think.
Yeah, true.
Again, there is a lot of like that. That's where the parallels come in. Again, with the 1970s, where they just really don't want to cause a recession. That's the basic idea. Is we've gone since 2008, 2009. We haven't had a serious recession. I think.
Anders legally had one, I think, in 2015.
Well, and without devolving into a conversation about the definition of a recession, the group, the NBER group or whatever that does designate recessions, actually designated a recession in 2020, the COVID, for a couple months during COVID. Yeah. That was actually, they designated that as a 2-month recession or something like that. So there's been a couple of very small recessions since 2008, 2009, but nothing substantial.
Nothing that anybody would even really think about. Like, just general public wouldn't even noticed, truly. Like, unless you actually got your, you lost your job. I would just say from the general consciousness of America and Canada, it just wasn't something that happened, though technically it did.
I think people would have noticed the 2020 COVID one, but again, very short-lived and very acute situation that didn't persist, and then there was heaps of free money given out in response, like crazy unemployment benefits, blah blah blah. So people were probably actually, in fact, happy that recession happened.
Yeah, they probably actually made more money over that recession.
in the back end. Right. So
Not everybody, but a good chunk.
I think at the very least, there haven't been price controls on things yet, thankfully. Although you can see a bit of the reaction with the releasing oil from the strategic reserves in the U.S. They've been artificially keeping supply up through that.
What I've seen for analysis of that, though, it's more of a political gesture. Like they would need to do double or triple the numbers they're doing to really make a dent in oil prices. Like it makes a small effect, but the biggest thing is the image that Biden's doing something.
See that because it really is. It's been like $1 million a day roughly, which is like 1% of consumption. So it's not a huge amount. Yeah, so I can see that being more of a very small band-aid on a pretty big wound. But I think one thing to point out is how inflation interacts with like expectation. A lot of the problem with inflation is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that once people start to assume high inflation going forward, they do things which inevitably bring about high inflation. And easy example is wages. So if you're living in a highly inflationary environment where prices are continually going up, when you go to negotiate, your union goes to negotiate a contract, or you go to job hunt or whatever it may be, you're not going to be okay with a flat pay. You're going to want substantial wage increases, and you're probably actually going to want wage increases beyond what the current level of inflation is, because it's an inflationary environment. You want to get ahead. You don't want to fall further and further behind. And so you get a wage increase. Well, what does a wage increase do for your spending power? It increases your spending power. You start buying more stuff, which drives up the price of that stuff. And so that increases.
I saw a story about a union on the railways in Britain that got a wage increase of 20% because inflation was 8%. It's like,
This a recent one?
Pretty powerful union. No,
strikes?
this was
Or 70s.
No, this was, I think it was brought up in relation to these rail strikes. This was much longer ago in the 70s, but they're basically saying that they don't expect the current railway strikes to be able to accomplish anything of the sort.
Yeah, so as you can see, 20% much higher than 8, which then those workers have more money, which they spend more, and then it can spiral, and then you hit 20%, and then the workers want more, and businesses scale back. Business costs increase due to wage increases, which means they scale back production, which means there's less goods, which means price increases, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why like expectation is such an important part of inflation, and that's why there's been such an emphasis on being hawkish with inflation, because it's just so much easier for the economy to nip it in the bud and not let it even start, and not even let those inflation expectations start to even form, than it is to start it to spiral at all.
Yeah,
the amount of effort required is just so much higher once it started to spiral at all.
I wanted to also point out, like, people, like, if they're expecting inflation, they'll start buying more and more now, because they think, like, okay, well, I'll fill my deep freeze full of stuff now because it's going to be, next month or 2 months from now, it's going to go up. I'll grab more canned goods. And so they start dumping more money. So they like, just across the board, even if their wages didn't go up, a lot of time they'll just start purchasing more stuff now. Like, okay, sometime this year might need a new refrigerator or something like that. Well, I'm just going to buy it now because 6 months from now, it could actually go up another 10%. So, and then if you have a decent enough chunk of the population thinking that way and spending that way, then you get a whole bunch more people going and purchasing all of those same things. It just, you don't have the supply. So the people, or like the providers, the sellers, they'll increase the prices because there's demand for it, and they don't have the production to keep up. So they just bump up the price. So that's like another avenue of how this spirals.
Well, and expect with debt as well.
What's up?
I've been spending money like that for 2 years.
Well, I was just going to add that like debt also plays into that, where if you are able to take out debt to, like you said, buy things that are probably going to be more expensive in the future, why wouldn't you? Because inflation is going to erode away the value of that debt. So debt can also accelerate the inflation spiral. If interest rates are, moderated, right? Like if it's cheap debt available, then why wouldn't you take it on and go and buy whatever you can if things are going to be more expensive in the future?
An interesting thing that Milton Friedman talks about is he thinks a lot of economic problems result from the fact that your personal economic life is usually an inverse to the macroeconomic picture. And his example he gave was that for most people, the price is constant and the quantity changes. Like you go to a store, you can buy as much as you want as long as the store is not out of stock. But for the economy, the price changes and the quantity is constant. And I thought that was an interesting way of framing it that makes a lot of sense. It's like, yeah, normal people just don't realize the impacts that, they're having on their individual purchase on the greater economy.
Yeah, and so basically getting that spiral under control is paramount when it happens. And I think, I guess the optimistic case is that because central banks and economies have had more experience dealing with inflation and stagflation in the past, they will be aware of that and get it under control, and we won't have to repeat the 1970s and the 2020s. I think, just in my thinking, the big elephant in the room, the problem is the election cycle, essentially, and there's such reluctance to have any sort of economic pain in democracies, which means getting inflation expectation under control in a fairly difficult and painful recession that could definitely be the result of the necessary interest rate hikes. It's just never going to be politically viable in this day and age. Like, you could see the political pressure mounting on central banks to kind of half-ass it and start to dial back the interest rates, start opening the taps again as soon as things start to falter and the economic situation starts to deteriorate, and before the inflation has got under control, and then it spirals because that's what it naturally does. So I think, just from my assessment, it's really coming. It's gonna, whether or not we do get or even have the chance to get stagflation, is going to really come down to central banks and whether or not they have the guts to just follow through on rate hikes and let the economy do what it does in the face of that without wavering.
Yeah, you and I had been discussing earlier before we started the podcast. Basically, you mentioned that, who was it? It was some billionaire investor was saying that to control inflation, you need at least 5% for the bank rate. So that means like the basic rate from the Fed or the Bank of Canada being 5% to actually tamp down inflation. And just to put that in perspective, if that is true,
not quite. When inflation starts to spiral, the observation that had been made was that usually you have to hit, like, the empirical evidence shows that you have to get around 5% before you actually get the spiral stopped. There hasn't been periods where you can just float in at 2 or 3 or 4% interest rates and get inflation back under control once it started spiraling. So
So
we're
I guess
at
it depends
the
if we're in a spiral right
Start
now.
of the spiral.
we are like those inflation rates that would be considered in that danger zone have been hit, right? Like the US hit 9.1,
Yeah, Canada,
Canada
was 8.3 or something.
I
high
think Britain
mid
is
high
10.
Yeah.
so those are definitely numbers that are in that class, right? And I think the UK was saying they expect inflation to hit as high as 13 by the end of the year. So they're
I think they're the worst in the world right now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
from
they're-
what I was...
At least the worst, not counting, Turkey, but the worst in the Western world.
developed, fully.
Yeah, Turkey's a tough one,
Yeah, so
Basically,
I
you
think-
need to double the current rate because we're at 2.5, which is like historically pretty low. To be fair, like that's still really, really low. I just gotta go find it.
we're at 2.5 in the US, 2.5 in Canada. I think 1.5 in the UK right now. the EU is still at. I think they hit 0 now. I think they're at a negative rates. They were at negative rates for a while.
Japan, I think, is
Japan's at a
just
negative. They're
business
at
as
negative
usual.
0.1.
Still not getting inflation.
Yeah, France and Italy are 0.5. The UK.
Japan might actually be able to hit 2% for the first time in a long time. Their problem has been creating inflation.
Well, that's actually one talking about different countries. The one other difference between the 70s and now that gives some hope for now is the strength of the US dollar, at least for the US situation, because that is a natural buffer against inflation, right? The stronger the dollar, the cheaper, relatively cheaper it is to buy imported goods from abroad.
Yeah,
and right now the
buy
US
your way out of things.
Yeah, and the US
Buy your
dollar
way
is
out of
just
the supply side issue.
and with the US dollar just skyrocketing, that might alleviate some of the price increases for the US at least. I mean, it's going to make things worse for Europe. So, Europe, the situation
Not
is
looking mint.
it's difficult. I think I have a lot less information on Europe, but the amount that I looked at, it's just not good.
Yeah, especially
the US
depending on what happens with the energy from Russia. Like,
One of
could
the
get
sleep
so much worse.
One of the sleepers too is Turkey. That it even slips my mind all the time. But they're going through a dramatic economic upheaval on the basis of inflation that's threatening to turn into hyperinflation. I think their official rate is 50%, but like on the ground, it's almost 100%. It's just crazy.
Yeah,
And they have a huge military.
Turkey is 79.6 at the moment. Their interest rates are 14.
Yeah, like they could cause problems in the world if something
Yeah, they're a pretty
happens
big
in them.
country.
They're not. Yeah, they're connected to a lot of important countries. Like
Yeah, and
they're in
they're
geographical
85
important
million.
location.
Like they're no small, like
Well,
5 million spit of land.
the
Not
big
like
problem with
Slovakia.
Turkey is that they control the Black Sea access, which is
Yeah.
where all the Ukrainian and a lot of Russian all Ukrainian food exports go out through the Black Sea, and almost all the Russian ones as well. So
If they start having really bad economic problems, they might just start seizing things.
yeah, I don't know if that's a likely scenario, but it is worrisome that they are so important right now. Right now they have maximum leverage, I guess, with the Ukrainian situation, and they haven't shown themselves to be particularly stable in terms of the decision. You can rely on them to make the most self-interested decision possible, which I guess is a good thing. So they're a bit almost predictable in that manner, but they don't
accept in monetary policy. Their leader believes that the solution to inflation is stimulus, and that's what they've been doing for over a year.
Oh man.
Okay.
Well, that's unfortunate, but I think in terms of geopolitics, they're very self-interested. They're part of NATO, but they do not. They don't back every NATO play. they don't like Russia, but they sometimes side with Russia, depending if it's, like they were dealing with them in Syria. They were against them in Syria, against them in Armenia, but they'll deal with them on certain issues. It's just they're very self-interested. So I mean, at least that is a little bit predictable in the sense like they're going to be selfish. You can just predict that. But I think going back to like the USD, it also helps Canada because our currency is staying steady with America because we supply a lot of. Well, I'm not 100% confident on all the reasons, but a lot of it I think has to do with the fact that we export a ton to America. America buys a lot of our stuff. We're a net energy exporter and a net exporter because of our 100% our energy sector, and that keeps our currency strong. So that helps Canada a lot in just having our currency currently buoyed as well, and we will be able to continue to buy imports, which we do import a lot of food stuff and other random stuff. We don't have much manufacturing. We don't have much. We don't have a lot of varied agriculture, right?
Yeah, like we like our fruits and vegetables from South America.
Yeah, trade wheat for everything else, and I guess canola.
Wheat and potatoes.
So I think maybe it'll be a more regional situation in 2022 than in the 70s. But who knows?
Yeah, that seems likely unless the US somehow gets into it as like proper stagflation, because in that case, I think it has to spread to the world. But if it's like Europe, they're not as important as the US is globally, so it won't spread as badly.
Yeah, I think this is stretching my knowledge a lot, but I think the big thing there is like the US currency is the reserve currency. Mm-hmm. So if the US goes into stagflation, that it's just because their currency is what everything else is denominated in, and so many global transactions happen in it. It just is so much more likely to spill out than if it happens in parts of Europe or Turkey, I guess like or whatever.
The thing for Europe is that it's regional to Europe, but outside of Britain, like if Germany goes, I think it screws the whole Eurozone because they have the problem of everyone using the euro. So if their biggest economy gets into stagflation, it's going to mess everything up.
Yeah, if the whole Eurozone goes, like that's
you
still
could
going to have a pretty big impact on the rest of the world because it's 500 million people, mostly developed nations. Like it's probably not as bad as the States going, but it's still going to cause, I think, pretty big problems.
You could do everything right as Italy, but I don't think they're going to have much of a say in what happens with the Eurozone.
No, I would agree.
Well, I think the risk, right, with the Eurozone is just lower because you don't have developing countries that are all borrowed in euro denominations, whereas the USD, right, if they have to crank his interest rates to get out of a stagflation to 10% or whatever, that is just absolutely going to annihilate so many developing countries that have all their debt denominated in USD, which is already happening with their 2.5% interest rate increases, which is strengthening the US dollar and just crushing developing countries. So I don't know how much worse that gets if the US is at 5% or 6% and the US dollar continues to march up. It's just not going to be a good scene in lots of parts of the world. Do we have anything to go further on with current to past, or should we just move into talking about like
the one thing
implications?
The one thing I did see that people were saying that like, this is one of the reasons why it's probably not going to be as bad in 2022, just because compared to the 1970s is just households. There's one, like, households spend less of their income on energy requirements in the States. So, like, that makes sense to me. Like, you're not going to be as sensitive to a big supply shock there. But one of the things that I noticed they said, or at least an idea that was being kicked around, is households are spending less in servicing their household debt nowadays, but compared to the 1970s. And I just think that was very likely due
Just
to the
interest rates.
Exactly. So it's like, if you do see like a pretty big uptick, like even a couple more percent uptick in the rates, that could be another precipitating moment where you just have a huge amount of people, with student loans and with car debt and house debt and all of that, especially with inflated, asset prices. If that occurs, like, you could start to have some pretty nasty economic problems. And then if the government's like, okay, shit, we're moving into a recession, that might actually really push the government to try to lower interest rates again and then kick off more inflation. Like, that is one thing
Again,
I don't think is good in comparison to the 1970s. But again, I really have no idea what will actually happen there. But
I think the bottom line there is that it's really up to the central bank, the Fed, because what you're just discussing, all those factors you're discussing is recession, right? Like,
yeah, and then
debt repayment, all these things are going to be recessionary. If the Federal Reserve says, fuck you guys, deal with your recession, then great, stagflation's off the table. Giant recession, yeah, it's on the table. But I think in the long run, that's what would be better for the economy for sure, is just a strong and serious recession. For, generally recessions don't last for 10 years or 15 years. They last for, 1 to 2 years.
Yeah, and in comparison, stagflation last time lasted like 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the economy would be better off just having a 1 to 2 year serious downturn. And yeah, recessions aren't fun, but we made this point really early in the podcast that stagflation is not a common part of the business cycle, while recessions are. So, we're kind of overdue for one anyway. And there's, you can find proponents on both sides, but there's tons of economists and business people and other such types that will say, yeah, recessions are actually necessary. Like, they knock out the companies that aren't viable. They improve capital allocation. They're just healthy to get things reset back to baseline, essentially. And I don't think I've ever seen, or would you'd ever see, an economist or business leader saying, yes, stagflation is good for the economy, it has benefits, it helps us with this, it helps. No, there's no argument to be made that stagflation is healthy or necessary or natural part of the business cycle. So I think recession,
it was literally thought impossible at one point by the majority of economists. So
yeah, and I have never seen a post 1970s analysis that was like, oh, that was a great decade, let's do it again sometime. It really helped. So I think it's just, you'd much rather take the recession on the chin, get it over with. It's overdue. It's healthy for the economy, and move on. But I think that's just really in the lap of the Federal Reserve. Like, if they get spooked, like you were saying, household debt is at all-time highs, and some factors start to turn sour, and they get spooked, and they start getting dovish again on the economy, and they start pumping money back in. Yeah, we could be in for it.
I feel like this is a wild conjecture that I just can't resist saying. And the worst case scenario for stagflation is another fall of the Roman Empire. Little known fact, Roman Empire, stagnant economy. Try and solve that problem. They debased their currency, which inflated the currency. about 15,000%. And a couple generations, Roman Empires, no more. Stagflation.
Yeah, I think you'll have to add that to the, I don't know how many, probably
Wikipedia?
7 or 9 or 1,100 different explanations for why the Roman Empire fell. So
Yeah.
Well, you can write the definitive book on this particular one.
it might be the one. It really might.
This is coming out after we hit stagflation. Gotta have people relate to it, you know. Feel what it was like to be in ancient Rome, stagflating to death.
Yeah.
Over generations. All right.
So do we
can kind of
get into the nitty gritty?
Yep. So I think, yeah, but just, do you guys have any implications for what it means for regular folks, and any thoughts on what people can do to potentially protect themselves if this, stagflation really does come to pass, or even a recession?
Yeah, well, as a financial professional, this is financial advice. Take it 100% at face value. Do exactly what I say. You will be rich. So I just want to put that disclaimer out there. I don't think there's any like specific advice other than like the same kind of old tired investing advice and like just general financial advice that you get for most environments, which is, don't be over leveraged. Don't be spending more than you can or more than you earn. Like it's pretty generic advice at this point. Like
decent nest egg in case you do lose your job, in case
I'll hit you with
recession.
I'll hit you with the financial advice that'll make you rich. What you want to do is take out the biggest loan you can, because that's denominated in this soft fiat currency. What you want to do is go and buy some gold with all that money and just watch yourself rake in the cash, because gold and oil outperform in stagflation. It's been proven in 1970. It'll happen again. And then you just convert that back, a little bit of your gold back, and you pay off your debt, because the inflation has made your debt worthless. Easy.
See, you're living in the
one listener to this, and he or she will take our advice and then come after us when he loses everything.
Yeah, come after us to give me $1 million. Like,
you're living in the 20th century. I'm living in the 21st. So what you want to do is you want to take out a huge loan, like you're saying, but you want to put it into cryptocurrency, because that's the new gold, right? So your advice is just date it.
Bitcoin
right?
garbage. It's got to be.
And then you want to first borrow the money at leverage, and then you want to put it onto an exchange that you can also invest it at leverage. So you want to get up somewhere around probably 1,000 to 10,000% leverage, somewhere in that range, right? And then you're golden.
It's just literally can't go tits up.
Yeah, it's surefire money. But in all seriousness, like, yes, in stagflation, what are you looking at? High unemployment and inflation. What can you do in the face of those things? Again, not a ton, other than the generic stuff like keep your skills polished so you're employable. Save some money.
Updated.
Yeah, save some money. Have like a bit of a emergency fund in case you do lose your job. And then in terms of like dealing with the inflation, I mean,
stoke the anticipatory fears and just start buying in bulk all the time, and encourage all of your friends to do the same, just so that expectation kicks in hard.
Well, I think the one thing that you can actually do in inflationary environments is be a little bit more self-sufficient, because like just cutting your, like, reversing some lifestyle creep and cutting down your spending is a huge combat to inflation. If you're not eating out, if you're not doing the things that are going up in price, you're just, not going to be impacted by inflation. So, growing some of your own food.
Because you'll still be certain things you have to buy that it will be inflating, but you'll be less impacted significantly.
Yeah. So growing your own food, that's, maybe finding ways to lower your energy use, finding ways to entertainment avenues that are less dependent on spending money, so hobbies that are cheap. Like just keeping your spending down, or like having a plan to cut your spending if necessary in the future. Having some things lined up.
Something I saw that was interesting that seemed to be disregarded for some reason. I think it was on a gold promoting website or something. But basically, during the stagflation of the 70s, the real return on an S&P index was something like negative 2%, which is a hell of a lot better than getting 10% inflation on your cash.
True.
Like, although it doesn't feel good to be losing money in the stock market, but the stock market didn't crash. It just didn't grow as fast as inflation.
Yeah, I think there's no guaranteed, like, that's the other thing is like, don't pay attention to investment advice that is like, oh, this one such and such is, like the best thing to invest in during inflation. There, as far as I've been able to tell, there is no, any single thing that is done well in inflationary environments. There's nothing that is a tried and true inflation hedge. There just isn't. There's some periods of inflation where gold has done really well. There's some periods where it didn't. There's other, real estate even, the inflation is, even now, right, is pretty high, but real estate is on the verge of decline. Like, there's just no tried and true method for investing during inflation that is quote unquote better than during regular times. So just like, I think the basic thing for investing is just stick to your normal investing patterns. Don't upend everything because, there's some potential for inflation or stagflation. Like, you're not gonna beat the tried and true methods that win out during any other time.
Well, if there was some massive thing, then everyone would run into it, which would probably decrease your return on investment until it wasn't a massively outperforming sector anymore. Like, that's kind of how everything works. Like, you're going to be super obvious, everyone would be doing it, and then it wouldn't be a huge
all the
market
value
leader.
Gets sucked up, right?
And the likelihood that you're going to be the one that finds that beat as an individual person is just low.
And
so
before it actually becomes, everybody figures it out, it's pretty much a 0% chance. Tried and true is boring, but at the same time, it's the thing that stops you from falling off a cliff.
I guess, and
the best option. Most other things are just going to cause more harm than good. So, yes, it's boring, not very sexy, but hey, that's kind of how a lot of life is, and it's better that than getting torched.
Speak for yourself. My life is an action movie every day.
Okay, Gosling.
I think the one other thing to mention is like the politics of it for individuals. And I think that there's the one thing there is like, I really don't see the claims of like, oh, we can just spend money willy-nilly and no negative consequences as having panned out, modern monetary theory essentially of just like, it'll all just work itself out in the wash and 2% inflation forever, bro. Like, clearly
Milton Friedman spins in his grave.
Yeah, clearly that it has not happened, and there is a limit to the spending that you can do without impacting inflation and the economy more broadly. So if someone, if a politician is promising you something that sounds too good to be true, like, oh yeah, we can just spend forever and ever and ever and
sing.
Yeah, and like nothing bad will happen, and it's just like, it'll eventually things will just be fine. Like, don't worry about it, bro. Like, that's probably too good to be true, and things are probably not going to just work out magically.
Look exactly how the spending during COVID turned out. We printed in Canada $500 billion, and the claims were no, it's not going to cause inflation like that. Those theories are dead and old, and it'll be fine. And then when inflation did start cropping up, the narrative was like, oh, it's only transitory. It's going to be like 3% transitory. It'll be gone by next month, maybe the month after, and then bang, we're at 8%. Probably going to keep climbing. So, exactly. If a politician is saying that this is going to work out hunky dory, the preponderance of evidence suggests that they are absolutely full of shit.
Nobody could have predicted that more money would lead to more inflation. It's just like, who would think something like that? That's crazy talk. Crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's never happened before.
Yeah, I just be very skeptical as always with politicians. They might not have your best interest at heart. It's possible. They could have re-election in their mind.
Well, if they do have your best interests at heart, so they're just lying to you, and then they don't do those policies. Lying to you to get reelected, so they can't do those policies for your own good.
Exactly. All right. Well, that's it. That's all I had. Unless you guys got anything more, I think
I think that's good for me.
Yeah, about sums it up.
All right. Thanks for listening. Peace.
Peace.
Peace.